All right. If I'd have known there was a speed dating section, I probably would have signed up for that part. Although I'm married, so that might have not gone well anyway. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about herbicide resistance, and specifically I'm going to focus on one weed in particular that we have here in Wyoming that is really problematic because of herbicide resistance, in addition to a lot of other things. And I'm going to specifically talk about kochia, which is a weed that a lot of us know well. I found a couple examples. We pulled this one out of the irrigated section. This is actually out of one of my dry bean plots. It's a little wilted because we picked it about 1 o'clock and then it just sat in the heat for a while. So now that those roots aren't able to take up any water, it's already wilting a little bit. But you can see it's a pretty nice healthy looking specimen. And then this guy I actually just picked out right back here a little ways in an area that was non-irrigated. And that's a pretty interesting thing because kochia is one of the few weeds that is a really major economic problem both in irrigated crops and in dryland crops. That's really not a common thing for weeds. Usually they're very well adapted to very wet areas, and those weeds tend to compete really well in irrigated crops. Some crops are adapted to dryland conditions where they're very efficient water users. They germinate quickly when they come into contact with water, and so usually you get one or the other, but kochia is one that really spans that bridge. It can be competitive both in dryland crops and in irrigated crops. So another thing that makes it difficult to deal with is it produces a lot of seed. So you probably can't see that for those of you more than a couple tables away, but that one's got a lot of seed on it. And in fact, I would guess this plant right here probably has about 300,000 seeds that it's currently producing right now. So probably anywhere from 300,000 to 400,000 for a plant this size. That one from the irrigated section hasn't even started producing seed, so it's going to keep getting bigger before it would have started producing seed. It probably would have produced close to 500,000 seeds. So that's a lot of seeds. And what's the other thing that we know about kochia? What do we call it commonly? A tumbleweed. So it's a tumbleweed. So kochia and Russian thistle, another dryland weed that we have in the area, are the two plants that we most commonly refer to as tumbleweeds. So they're the ones you see blowing, catching up in the fence rows. And if you don't do a very good job of controlling this kochia plant, it's going to be your neighbor's problem in addition to yours the following year. So it has great dispersal mechanism. It produces a lot of seed. Another really cool adaptation that kochia has, this is actually a plant I just pulled from around the farm here where it's been mowed a few times. This guy's probably got 25 to 100 seeds on it. So it's been mowed repeatedly, very resistant to a lot of different types of control, including mowing. So this guy's going to produce seed, make it a problem for the next year. So sorry, Jim, you're going to be dealing with that one for a little while longer. But specifically for herbicide resistance, kochia has evolved resistance to a lot of different herbicides. In fact, almost all the herbicide types that we use, particularly in this region, kochia has evolved resistance to. One of the first ones that evolved resistance to were the ALS inhibitors. So things you might be familiar with are Glean in the wheat market a while back, Upbeat, common sugar beet herbicide, Ally, Raptor, Pursuit. A lot of different types of herbicides all fall into that broad category of ALS inhibitors. Most of the kochia in our area is resistant to those ALS inhibitors. We don't get very good kochia control when we use those herbicides anymore. It's also evolved resistance to the triazines, so atrazine and some of the others. Dicamba, so things you might know as Banville or Clarity or Status or Distinct. Kochia has evolved resistance to in different regions. I don't think it's a major problem here in this corner of Wyoming, but just across the state line in Nebraska there's some, in Colorado there's a little bit, up in Montana there's a little bit. So it's kind of scattered pockets throughout where you don't get good control of kochia with Clarity. And the most recent addition to the herbicide resistance in kochia has been glyphosate. And so I think most of you have probably got a handout. I think I only made 60 copies, so I wasn't expecting this great turnout. That's a good thing. So you might have to share with your neighbor. But on that handout, there's a map at the top corner of one of either the front or the back. So it's a map of the United States with some yellow states filled in. So all of those states that have a yellow state filled in, that's where they've already documented kochia that is resistant to the herbicide glyphosate. So what do you notice about where Wyoming is on this map? And this isn't a geography test. I'm assuming we all know where Wyoming is. I didn't write it on there. But we all know where Wyoming is, right? So I had to ask my wife where it was just to make sure. But what do you notice about Wyoming in relation to all those yellow states?
You haven't reported it yet.
Yeah, we haven't reported it yet. And I'm trying real hard not to. But we're surrounded. I fully expect we're probably going to see glyphosate-resistant kochia sometime within the next year or two. Even if we do everything right, because of the nature of kochia, it's probably going to roll in from Nebraska or Colorado or Montana. Someone's going to truck it into our area, even if we do everything right. So it's a problem that we're going to be managing, whether we like it or not, even if we do, like I said, everything right. Okay, so one of the things I've been doing basically since I started here at the University of Wyoming in 2007 has been trying to get in front of this potential problem of glyphosate-resistant kochia that is also probably resistant to some of the other herbicides that we would normally use for control of glyphosate-resistant weeds. So we've done a series of probably 10 to 12 different studies here at SAREC, most of them in collaboration with other states. We've collaborated with Colorado State University, South Dakota State University, University of Nebraska, and Colorado State University to try and come up with some regional recommendations on what we need to do to get ahead of this problem before it really becomes a major economic problem. Because still the only area where glyphosate-resistant kochia I think is widespread enough to be extremely troublesome is in Kansas. I think as you move north, it's problematic in some small areas, but it isn't exceptionally widespread. It's becoming worse in Colorado and Nebraska, and again, I fully expect it to become worse in Colorado, Montana, and actually up into Canada now too. So if you look at the map right next to the big map of the United States, the map with the kind of red outline and the green stars, so that's a map of all of the study sites for one of the first studies that we decided to do when we're trying to look at kochia management. Because one of the things we need to know is, what can we do as far as tillage? How does the seed that it produces, because, when a plant produces 300,000 seeds, we need to know, can we bury it and then it doesn't come up anymore, or is that not going to be effective? So we need to know if tillage is going to be effective. And so all of those green stars represent sites where we did seed burial studies and also seed emergence studies. And one of the things we found from the seed burial studies is if you bury kochia seed to about 4 inches or more, it doesn't survive very well. So if you bury it even at 1 inch or 2 inches, usually within 1 year to 2 years, you'll have eliminated about 95% of the seed that was produced this year if you till it and bury it. Now, even if you kill 95% of the seed that way, what's 5% of 300,000 seeds? A lot. That's how I do math in my office. Any percent of 300,000 is a lot. So even though we can kill a lot of it that way, we still need to come up with solutions for that remaining 5%, which is still a lot of plants that's going to rob yield from our wheat or our sugar beets or our corn. And so another thing we did is try to figure out what are the germination characteristics of kochia, because one of the things, especially if we're targeting kochia with herbicides, we need to know when we have to go out to spray, particularly if we've lost control of kochia with post-emergence herbicides like with glyphosate or Roundup. We need to know how early we have to be out in the field in order to spray a pre-emergent herbicide in order to control it before it comes up. Well, one of the things we did at all of these locations with those green stars was an emergence trial. So we basically went out to an area, and we went up on the dry land here at SAREC, and every week we just had a known area where we counted all the plants that came up and pulled them out of the ground. Exceptionally tedious work, not a lot of fun, but it produced a lot of really interesting data. And the graph you see was the prettiest of the sites, which is why I'm presenting it. It's not the one from Lingle, but it was the one from Scottsbluff because it made a prettier chart. But the data line right below it, 90% of kochia emergence was complete by May 7th. That actually is from Lingle. So by May 7th, 90% of the kochia that emerged was already up, which means if you're going out there on May 1st or so and applying a herbicide that you're hoping to control it before it comes up, you've missed it. You're way too late. So most of the time for pre-emergence control of kochia, we have to be back mid-March in our area in order to get control of kochia before it comes up. That's really challenging, particularly on fallow acres where we don't want to spend a lot of money and go out there that early. You basically have to be out there as soon as the snow melts. You're out there spraying, and that's really difficult to do. And so that's another challenge that we've got to deal with when we're dealing with kochia. And if you look at that bottom graph on that page, that's just kind of the relative emergence time is how you can think of it. So basically, over on the left side, you'll see weed species that tend to emerge when the soil temperatures are cool. And over on the right side, it goes to the warm season weeds. So things that would emerge late in the season are things like redroot pigweed, common purslane, common cockleburr. So those are the things you tend to see, tend to be problems in dry beans and maybe some corn. But if you look at those early season weeds, kochia, common lamb's quarters, wild oat, those are the problematic weeds we see early in the season. And kochia is, one of the first weeds to emerge in the season, which means if we're going to try to control it in crops, we need to be out there with pre-emergent herbicides or very early post-emergence herbicides. And once we've lost the utility of glyphosate, if it becomes glyphosate resistant, then we're going to be much more dependent on pre-emergent herbicides because our post-emergence tools are a lot lower, especially when we get into certain crops. Speaking of different crops, we do grow a lot of crops in this region. And so another part of that 5-state project that we were working on is represented in that yellow slide on the top of the next page. And those box and whisker plots give you some idea of the variability that we saw. The blue square is basically the average control we got in each crop. And each of those crops, so the wheat, sugar beet, soybean, fallow corn, represent the top 3 herbicides we could develop for each of those crops. And then the average that you see there in those box and whisker plots is the average of those 3 treatments across 10 different sites. So 2 years and 5 sites each. So basically 10 different growing environments. And the first thing you'll notice there is with corn, we can get really good control and it's really consistent. We have a lot of herbicide products available in corn for management of kochia that don't involve glyphosate. So if you're growing Roundup Ready corn, you have a lot of options to control it, even if you can't control it with your Roundup. But what do you notice about sugar beet? We got really poor control of kochia in sugar beet. So if we get glyphosate-resistant kochia, which we're controlling very well in Roundup Ready sugar beet, if it becomes glyphosate-resistant, we're going to have a really hard time controlling kochia. That range was about 50 to 70% over most of the area in those 5 sites. So really difficult to control. So if we do a really good job of kochia control in sugar beet, we can maybe get 70% if we don't have glyphosate to help us. So that's not very good. So one of the next steps that we took here at SAREC, and I worked with Bob Wilson over at the University of Nebraska to do this next step, is summarized in that next table. We looked at corn herbicides that allow rotation to sugar beet. Because one of the biggest issues, especially when you're working with our colleagues over in eastern Nebraska and Kansas, you start talking corn herbicides and they bring up things like atrazine, they bring up things like Balance, they bring up things like Callisto. Well, the plant-back restrictions to sugar beet on all those products are anywhere from 12 months to almost 3 years. So if you're going to try and control kochia in corn, but you want to grow sugar beets or dry beans the next year, your herbicide options are much more limited. And so what we did is actually look at the various herbicides that will allow you to rotate to sugar beets the next year. And you can see we still do have some pretty good options for management of kochia. We were able to get 80 to 95%, and that's averaged over 2 sites. We've actually repeated that study. One of the studies out there in the field this year is a repeat of that study, and it's also being repeated there at Scotts Bluff. And just to give you an impact of what that difference in kochia control, so that very bottom table, if you look at the kochia control in corn that we got in 2012, ranging from 70 up to 99%, and then you go look at the kochia density that we counted this year in our sugar beet plots from those corn plots last year, you can see the impact. If we got 70% control of kochia last year, we've got 33 plants per square foot this year. That's a lot of kochia. That's a lot of sugar beet yield loss that you're going to be sustaining. And if you look at how long that's going to take you to hand weed that's going to take you about a little over 3.5 hours per acre to hand weed. And once you've missed glyphosate-resistant kochia in sugar beet, that's your primary option for controlling it is hand weeding. So that's going to take a long time to do that. Now, if you get really good control in your corn, 99% control, that's less than 1 plant per square foot. That's a leisurely stroll through your hand weeding those sugar beets. And in fact, a lot of people might not even bother sending hand labor through if you can get that good a control. So I guess to summarize, so I don't take up too much time here, it's really important to look at kind of the big picture when you're talking weed management. Because even though kochia is an annual weed, you can't think of weed control, particularly of kochia, as an annual process. particularly once we start developing herbicide resistance for some of these products that we're really relying heavily on, such as Roundup. Once we become glyphosate-resistant kochia, just thinking using Roundup in corn and then using Roundup next year in sugar beet, it's going to set yourself up for a really difficult situation later on. So you're better off thinking, okay, over my 3 or 4 crop rotation, if I'm growing sugar beets, dry beans, and sugar beets, in sugar beets, kochia or glyphosate is my best option, so maybe I'll use glyphosate there, maybe not rely on it quite so heavily in corn, and maybe throw in some status, which gives excellent control of kochia, even if it's glyphosate resistant. So again, the whole idea behind this is really thinking, what do we need to do cultural practice-wise? How do we set up our crop rotation? How do we develop a herbicide program that is thinking more long-term than just a single year in order to manage a weed that has been historically problematic both on dry land and in irrigated settings? And so that's kind of all I had to say. I hope we've been trying to get a lot of this information out so you can actually have it, but if you've got any questions about anything related to kochia management or really anything related to weed control, I'd be happy to answer them. I think my email and phone number are both pretty easy to find if you have any questions. If nothing else, call SAREC and they can give you my phone number too. So, thank you very much.